last question while I have you here. I'm super interested. Anybody who covers Asia, I'm very interested in the way they view China as a hegemon. Do you think Mearsheimer is right? Mearsheimer has this, I guess you would call it, realistic view of the world, and I don't think it's realistic at all. I think he's so accustomed to the way Western governments have controlled the world because whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's the United States, whether it's France, Britain, whatever, they had a very similar mindset in the way that they operated, with fighting one war after the next. And that goes back like thousands of years that you could just kind of see in the way that they've operated. I think he's looked at that. And from his point of view, okay, this is the way countries act when they become hegemons, when they become this kind of masters of the world. All of them effectively act the same. And so in his mind, well, when China is a hegemon, China is effectively going to act just like the United States because all hegemons have an interest in maintaining their power and exerting their power on a certain level. Do you agree with him on that? That whether it's the US, whether it's Russia, whether it's pick any random country, the UK, that China would effectively act the same way as the US or any other hegemon because the material pressures that are on countries when they become or reach that level are effectively the same. People are effectively the same. And so the way they act as countries are effectively the same. Do you buy that premise? I got to be honest, I don't agree with Mearsheimer on this, but what's your take on this? And this is the last question.
Well, I've wanted to have John Mearsheimer on my channel to talk about this. I have not been successful just yet, but because I do respect his work, I think that he has spoken up on important matters in ways that have reached people that might not be reached. However, no, I don't agree with this, and I think both of us have traveled to China. Both John Mearsheimer.
I was only there for 12 hours.
Several times. I know you you got the airport experience, but we've both been to China, and perhaps my focus when I go is just a little different in that when I go, I'm very interested in what I can observe and what I can learn from China that can tell me something about how both the United States' political foreign policy establishment talks about China versus how the Chinese talk about China. And every time I've gone, I'm only more firmly convinced that the way Chinese people and the way that the Chinese government talks about China is far more accurate than how the U.S. foreign policy establishment talks about China. And so the position that China is going to act once it is powerful enough, just like the United States or the West has over the course of many centuries of their rule as empires, I think negates the fact that China is right now already an economic powerhouse. Despite the fact that it's a developing country, if China wanted to and could, it could make investments and prioritize matters similarly to the United States, which in my estimation would probably collapse and destroy all of China because the people wouldn't allow it. So that I think this is where we have to understand that it's not about how countries, I think geopolitics oftentimes can be mistaken as countries are competing against each other. They're vying for spheres of influence. We've heard this recently in the New York Times that Trump administration wants to see spheres of influence, the Europe and Russia sphere of influence, the Asia sphere of influence with China, and of course the North American sphere of influence. All this, what I think is nonsense. But the point here is that if we conceive of the world like that, then we would assume that Russia and China, and we can just keep it on China here, operating the same way, but that is not precise. We're not looking at how China fundamentally organizes the society and what are its priorities. For whatever people think of the Communist Party of China, what does the Communist Party of China want? Does the Communist Party of China want to be a warmongering expansionist power that seeks to have China dominate over the rest of the world? Well, if you just read what the Chinese government says, Ray McGovern says all this all the time. He was a CIA analyst who literally read Soviet documents all the time and reported them what they said to the president. Well, you can do the same with China, and you can see what the Communist Party of China wants. It wants development. It wants sovereignty. It is very staunchly and firmly for multipolarity, and it wants to achieve various markers and goals that will uplift the Chinese people, rejuvenate the Chinese nation, as they say, and of course, make China a bigger part of a burgeoning multipolar world order. Now, then we can say, well, what is China doing? Is it matching up? If you listen to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, then perhaps you might believe that, well, China is interfering in the South China Sea and it's trying to take Taiwan and it's trying to bully its neighbors, despite the fact that China hasn't fought a war or even had any kind of significant military to military incursion over the past 40 plus years,
Right.
while the United States has literally been involved in more than 50. So if that's the case, then we can also look at what is China doing proactively to align with its stated objectives. Well, we've talked about it here. We've talked about China's massive technological development, the advances it's making on all fields in that realm, from AI to thorium to all kinds of things, renewable energy. When you go to China, you'll see that electric vehicles dominate the market. It's probably the only place in the world where that's actually true.
Yeah.
And this is the case for all Chinese cities, and the government is heavily involved in ensuring that people can afford these goods. And we can go across the board, from metro lines, high-speed rail, to the development of 5G technology, on and on and on. And all of that has the result of improving the lives of Chinese people, which is also just easily measured. Mainstream, the UN, various publications have acknowledged that China has indeed raised the standard of living of people in China to the point where it's eliminated extreme poverty. Whatever you think of that, it's good enough or not, you have judgments on it, whatever. But the point is it happened. 800 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty, and now it doesn't exist in China. If you go to China, you see that actually conditions continue to get steadily better, even as new challenges emerge, whether it's employment, of course, and real estate costs, what have you. But the arc of progress still remains the same. So if that's the case, there's no wars, there's development, prosperity. Why would that change just because China now is becoming the number one economy and will eventually in GDP terms become the number one economy? In fact, China doesn't even have the infrastructure. It has the military arsenal, it has the economy, if it wanted to, theoretically and hypothetically, to become an expansionist power. But then again, what would drive it? What would drive the CPC? What would drive the Chinese people to cheer for that? Well, absolutely nothing. And in fact, China, well, I'm not an expert in Chinese history, but there's a huge move in China to look at 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. The word civilization now is everywhere in the political conversations and dialogue. And of course, you'll see it with this, no matter what city you go to, you'll see this huge push to preserve and to highlight Chinese civilization from its entire history, as well as modernize, kind of side by side. And it's always a very interesting contrast. But nonetheless, so we have to ask, what would push China to act in the way that the United States does? Well, it would have to have the same push factors that the United States has. It would need a huge monopoly class of warmongers that are seeking maximum profits for weapons manufacturers and Wall Street. It would need to essentially do what the Soviet Union did when it collapsed. It would need to privatize everything. But we know that when that occurs, actually the system becomes completely unfunctional. So for an economy, so actually there is no route even for China to go in this direction, because history for China is a lot different than history for the United States. China didn't begin as some kind of colonial project that then morphed into a monopoly imperial power. China started from its own thousands of years of civilization, from a place of relative advancement for that period and into its own development process toward modernity. And it never reached a stage where it built the rudiments of a society that is driven by this kind of expansionist motives. So that, I think, is to me where this argument that China will just suddenly become this. It's almost like we have to assume that humans are driven by this lust for power that can just be snapped and changed in
Yeah.
an instant, when in fact what actually drives human beings, what actually drives society, is what conditions they are confronted with in front of them, and that ultimately shapes how they behave. Now, China doesn't necessarily want zero power. It doesn't want no influence. However, the way it defines influence, the way it defines what it means to be a bigger power, what it means to be an influential country, is just different than how the United States sees it. The United States
Mhm.
sees military power, dominance, the ability to dictate terms to other countries, etc., as the measures and hallmarks of power. China sees the ability to cooperate, to have everybody win together, to be able to develop as fast and as efficiently and with specific goals in mind for yourself as a big part of this, as well as how well can you, and we see this in terms of China's behavior, sometimes to the point of criticism. People criticize China. Why don't you intervene here? Why don't you be stronger there politically, diplomatically, militarily? And it's because China sees as a huge imperative non-interference, the ability to not interfere in the affairs of others, countries, and peoples is a huge priority for China. And why? Because China has a long history of what it means for that to happen to them. And they know that interference can often lead to misunderstanding, can often lead to destruction of society, of culture, of economies, of development itself. So there is I guess if we are to look at this hypothetically, we would need to see a counter revolution in China
Yeah.
for any kind of expansionist and imperialistic ways of looking at the world to emerge. But I would argue that that kind of counter revolution is impossible, because a counter revolution in China would really be the ruin of China. It would destroy its capacity to use what it has developed, all of these advancements. It would destroy that capacity, because China isn't built and organized in a way that would lead that capital can just take hold of it and run. No, we saw that at the Soviet Union. When capital defeated the Soviet Union, when the United States and the Western powers defeated the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union collapsed on itself, what happened? The Soviet Union became worse than a
Yeah.
junior partner. It became a basket case. It was totally decimated. It was divided. It was cut up, and it was destroyed. That's the plan, actually, for the United States. The Zhang Weiwei, the renowned professor of Fudan University, who I've
Mhm.
had the privilege of interviewing, he says that the Thucydides trap is not just, it's absolutely not a fact. That China is not going to fall into this trap of dominating for dominating's sake, like the United States, just because the United States is treating it in a certain way, because the consequences that China would have to bear for that are just too big. So, in short, it is just a completely different context that can't be compared in this way. And if that day were to come where that was possible, man, I don't even know. I don't think we would. I don't think we're going to be alive. I don't know who. We're looking at a future that we just cannot possibly even predict anywhere close. So
Danny,
no,
that is a fantastic question.
I don't agree with it. But at the same time, it's understandable that one would think this if we are to look at the development of societies, of geopolitics, of conflict itself
Through a Western
as
lens.
of a Western
Yeah.
lens, but one that says, well, power corrupts absolutely, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and if anybody is on top, that must mean the way they get there is by suppressing and making people suffer below them. China's model has actually shown that's not true. It hasn't fought the wars. It's not, it's not expanding. It has a big military that's not fighting anybody. It has an economy that is almost entirely self developed with the
Yeah.
help, of course, of the market. But at the same time, this is China's project. China has not been exporting this anywhere, and there's no proof that China's been exporting this anywhere beyond helping countries build the things that they need for them to develop themselves. And that's why we see the world moving more toward China, is because
Dan,
the reality is not the reality is that the world already sees China far differently than how the United States sees it. And this whole idea that China is going to just flip a switch and start
that's
dominating them
nonsense.
just
Yeah,
because it's at the top of the economic period is, I think, just not with any
I agree.
substantial or any evidence really at all.
I so agree with you. That's a great breakdown, by the way. I mean, he is looking through at this purely through a Western lens. Well, this is what Napoleon did. This is what the Brits did. This is what America did. What would the Soviet Union do? And even for the Soviet Union, they were true believers. Like the United States just thought, okay, well, that's just their ideological, this is BS. They're just using it for political gain. But when you listen to and look at the records of what they were saying, they fully believed it, meaning ideology does play a role in how countries act and respond in the larger world. And to your point, part of the reason that the US behaves in the way it does is because of the capitalistic system. It's, hey, there are resources in the country I want to get my hands on. There's a business interest I want to get my hands on. I want to break that country up in order to get my hand on, so forth. I need to overthrow that government. Meaning the motivation is being done by effectively people who want to make more cash and get their hand on resources. It's driven. It drives a certain ideology in the way that the US behaves in a way that China is not driven by those same things. You're perfectly right. It wasn't a settler colonial state. It didn't evolve in that way. Their ideology is different. And one last point. I don't know if you've ever read Three Body series. I'm a sucker for that series. That series is fantastic. But one of the things that the Chinese author of that book talks about history in the scope of thousands of years, which is hard for Americans to wrap their head around because our president is like 4 years. And the country is so young. We're talking about like a 300-year-old country. 5,000 years of history is mind-boggling. But that's the way they look at time. And that's the way they even plan stuff out, like 100 years. And so in the book, that comes through in the way that they're talking about like a philosophy or a governmental structure that goes over the course of the arc of time. Same thing with Wandering Earth. Same thing. This notion of thousands of years of continuity in regards to the way a government functions. But one of the things they were talking about was resist hegemony. Oh, I thought that was astonishing, right? And China is in Thucydides' trap. It's just not China by itself. China, Russia, Iran, all these countries are effectively running up against the way that the U.S. is behaving and trying to have this kind of full spectrum dominance. I don't think there's any way out of that trap. You're just kind of stuck with the results, just trying to prevent a larger conflict. Danny, man, fantastic breakdown. Fantastic breakdown. Thank you for this. I've heard people give their take on this. That was probably one of the best explanations. Logical. It made sense. It got to kind of the nub of, well, what is China's motivation and why is it their motivation as compared to what is the U.S. motivation and why is it their motivation? And how does that produce a larger outcome in the grand scheme of things? I agree with you. I don't know what that looks like for China to just all of a sudden become an expansionist country. And I don't even know why they would do it, considering their model. Don't get me wrong, they may throw their weight around, but I don't get the sense that they're trying to overthrow government and steal resources. That's not the way they function. Danny, man, thank you for this. I really do appreciate this. I honestly do. Danny Haiphong, journalist, geopolitical analyst. You can find him on Twitter at GeopoliticsDH, on YouTube at Geopolitics Haiphong. Danny, where else can people find you, by the way?
Well, people can, if they are able, they can go to Substack and Patreon. All these have free options now, thankfully. But if you're able to contribute, you can go to Patreon, Substack. Just look up. You can go to any one of my videos and find the handle Chronicles of Haiphong on Substack and just my name on Patreon. But any one of my videos will have all the ways that you can follow and support me. But really, social media, X is the best place. I'm not as active on there anymore. YouTube is really where I do all of my work. So definitely follow me there. As you said, Jamal, Geopolitics Haiphong is the handle, or just look at my name, Danny Haiphong, and you can find that channel, subscribe, and watch the videos. And yeah, thanks so much, Jamal. It was really great to be here. Hopefully we can do it again soon.
Absolutely. I hope so. I hope this wasn't too much of a pain. I would love to have you back. So I'm just putting that out there now. Thank you for this. I really do appreciate it. You have a good one,
course.
okay?
Yeah, you too.
By the way, what part of the country do you live in? Just so I
Oh, I'm
know.
in New York. Oh, I'm in New York, so I'm Eastern
Oh,
time.
you're in New York. Okay, so you're on the Eastern Coast. Okay. You have a fantastic evening, man. Be safe.
All right, you too.
But Danny Haiphong, definitely appreciate it. I have been trying to get him on the show for a while because he's a damn good